In this part of the presentation, I would like to talk about units of measure. In CSS, there are four types of units of measure: length, percentage, color units, and URLs. Length units are divided into two types: absolute units and relative units. When it comes to absolute units, they correspond to the measures that exist in real world, for example, centimeters and pixels. Now, we can use them in CSS, and they may appear to be great because they correspond to the measures which are standardized and are used widely in the real world. However, when it comes to working and publishing on the web, it's important to remember that we do not have any control on what size of the screen this information will be displayed on. Therefore, relative units are particularly important when it comes to web development. Let's have a look at the existing measures which can be used within CSS. Among the absolute lengths, we have centimeters, millimeters, inches, pixels, points, and picas. We are very much used to measuring font size in picas. We are already measuring screen sizes and quite familiar with pixels, where individual pixel specifies the size of the small square that can be colored in one color or the other, and obviously centimeters and millimeters that we use on a daily basis. Relative lengths are slightly different. Let's have a look at one of them. EM is a unit that is used for providing the size for textual information, and in this case, font sizes. The font size, when specified with EM, will be relative to the font size which is assigned to the parent tag. So in this case, if you specify that the font size is supposed to be 2EM, this means that the size will need to be twice as much as the font size that is assigned to the parent tag. REM is slightly different. Now, the relative information here is not coming to the direct parent of this particular element, but to the root element. So all the information is actually standardized along the root. So you can specify what the root element size should be, and then REM will specify how big or how small compared to the root element the font should be. Percentages is another relative measure, and percentages will highlight how much space, for example, a particular element should take. Should your table take the entire width of your page, or should it take only 20% of the width of your page? Should it take the entire height, or should it be 50% of the height of a particular element? So percentages will provide this relative measure for highlighting the size of a specific element. Now, URL is another value that I would like to talk about, and URLs are particularly useful because this is our very first functional property or functional value that we are using. We know that this is a functional value because it has got these little brackets. So every time we see little brackets, we know that we're referring to a value which is being calculated. So in this case, URL will actually give us some functionality for locating a specific resource which is located in a specific location. So URL is often used for providing background images. So if we have a look at an example here, we can use background image property and assign a specific picture, in this case profile.jpg, to be assigned to the background image. Let me do a quick demo to show you how some of these elements can be and some of these measures can be put into practice in real life. So I've created a little CodePen. We have H1 playing with measures, some sort of a paragraph, let's say testing, a couple of times, and let's apply a few measures in here. So one of the easiest things to do, and just to try how things work, is to use the to start using relative as well as the absolute measures. And I'll start with a font size. So I'll apply a font size for H1 and P. Let's say H1. The font size property is going to be, let's say, 16 px. I can actually use PC in here. Here we go. So this is the size of 16 PC in the font. I can change this to px, and px is much smaller compared to PC. So we can see that now the size of the font is much smaller. However, I could also use, so these are absolute measures. They are not changing if any information, any kind of viewport is changing. So these are absolute measures. Now, what I would like to do is to apply a relative measure here. Now, I would apply 2 EMs in this case, and we can see that 2 EMs, the size of the 2 EM, and we know that the size of the 2 EM is based on the value of the current font size that is applied to the parent of this particular element. So let's change this. Let's try and apply a new value to the body and say that the body of the element should have a font size of 3 EM. Now, what this is doing now is applying a font size to the entire body, and now H1 is building on what is the current size of the font and adding 2 additional EMs on what's already there. So you can see that by using EMs, it's possible that the fonts that we will be using further down your HTML tree will start growing and growing, and it will be difficult to identify where the information is, where the changes in your CSS are coming from. Good. So this is some of the examples of using font sizes when it comes to points or pixels, as well as relative measures such as EMs and REMs, right? Remember that when using these measures, you do not have to have a space between them. So it's not 5 space REM, but it should be 5 REM. Yep, good. So now let's move on to using backgrounds and background images. So background, to do this, I'm going to refer to the assets. And within the assets, I can select one of those images, which could be relevant for a background. Let's assume we could take this one, and I can copy the URL into the clip, into our clipboard, and add this here. So let's apply a background image to the body. Body, background image. So we'll apply the functional measure, URL, and then post the actual URL within brackets. Perfect. Don't forget the semicolon. So here we go. Now we have the body, which has got a image as a URL. We can see that we can change the size of the screen. Nothing is actually changing, right? And the image is a little bit too big for me, so I would like to make it smaller. So I'll say background image, background size, and let's put a specific measure, let's say 1000 pixels, and we can see that the picture became much smaller. Let's change 1000 pixels to something else, let's say 500 pixels. So now the image is much smaller, and we can see that the image is actually being repeated because it does not fit the entire page. So as the viewport is increasing, the image is actually being repeated. Now let's use a relative size. Rather than using pixels, I'm going to use percentages and use 100% here. So 100% will feed the image through the viewport. Now the interesting thing here is that as I'm reducing the size of a viewport, we can see that the size of the background image is changing too. However, the size of the text is not changing. Why is this the case? And this is because we used the relative measures for our text, REMs, which are relevant to the root element, and they are not changing. Now, this is why the length measures such as VW and VH are particularly useful. This is where the size is actually relevant to the size of a viewport. So I would like to go back and modify the size of our font using VH, for example. So let's go back and let's change H1 to 5 VH. Okay, perfect. Now it's smaller. Let's do 15 VH, or slightly bigger. Okay, 10 VH. So we can see that the text is bigger, but as the size of a viewport is going down, the text is actually going down too. So the paragraph size remains the same, but H1 is relative and is going down relative to the size of a viewport. The same is true for the background image because we apply percentages rather than fixed measures such as 500 pixels, for example. So I hope this provides you with a good demonstration of what kind of measures we can use within CSS, as well as understanding the difference between relative and absolute measures.